the understanding of this concept of the net generation. Could you put your hands up if you've heard this term before, the net generation? Okay, it's familiar to most of you, or a lot of you. I want to address that a little bit today because it's one of the things I think that influences some of the discussions we have about academic practice and academic development. The other question I'm going to leave until the end. But for now, at least, I can move this off to one side. Okay, so what I want to do is to explore with you this question, given the context of the day, given what it is you're going to be discussing later on in the day. I understand the deans are going to have a conversation about some of the institutional integration issues around e-learning. And as Sandra said, I've been in this e-learning space now for quite a significant time. I am in some ways an educational technologist, although I always wear the cloak of educational development. What I'm going to do is to talk about educational technology in the context of educational development. And I'm going to try and create a problem for you and then suggest some solutions. If at any point there's something you don't understand, Sandra can rush to the front, grab the microphone, turn me off and ask a question. So do shout, don't be completely passive for the duration of this meeting. I've got a history with you, and as you can see, I've got slightly thinner and slightly less hairy since my first visit to Zagreb in 2005 at the invitation then of Carnet, and we ran some workshops on online tutoring. As Sandra said, I was delighted to be part of the Tempest project, and I'm now at the London School of Economics, playing a slightly different role. I trust the presentation just went funny. I hope you can still see it okay. But this is what I'm going to talk about. There's a 6,000 word working paper which will go for publication, but it's based actually around what I want to talk about today. So I'm going to talk this through, and then I'm going to send this paper to Sandra tomorrow. I'm going to talk about some of the myths. I've highlighted one or two words that might be ambiguous, but we can talk about those a little bit later. The ideas, the myths, the things that may be not true that we're tackling, the challenges, some of the institutional situations, what we call frameworks for development in terms of academic development, to then address a particular model, which is my own, and then some conclusions. So hopefully that will give us ample opportunity at the end to have some questions. I've been saying for a long time in a variety of different contexts that universities are facing challenges. Clearly, a lot of people are saying this, and those of us who've held positions within institutions, management positions within institutions, are aware of the challenges that we face from funding agencies and from our own students. And one of the things which increasingly seems to require a response is this idea that there is something particularly unique about the generation now coming into universities, this generation that's sometimes referred to as the Y generation or the net generation. And I'm going to suggest that actually this is as much a creation of policymakers who have seen it as a stimulus for all kinds of initiative. And I want to really ask what that problem is and what the responses might be in terms of developing staff. So I'm going to problematize and then I hope provide some suggestions. Some of you will be familiar. This on the left-hand side of the screen, I hope it's visible to you, is something from an American called Michael Vench, and it's been very successful, very high profile. It's appeared at lots and lots of conferences. It's a short video, 4-minute video of students talking about their experience in a modern educational context. And whilst I have no doubt that everything that's contained within it is accurate, it was done as a little piece of action research with his own students, I think it perpetuates, in some senses, a myth that the current generation are all permanently wired, permanently connected. Now, there is no doubt that there is a huge degree of interconnectivity, of engagement, of technology, of literacy. amongst the current generation, if you like, or current cohort that's coming into our universities. But I'd like to, in a sense, put to one side the idea that this is a distinct generation. What I would suggest is that the whole nature of knowledge as a result of the changes that have taken place, certainly in the last 10 years, but perhaps in the last 30, has seen an increasingly rabid move towards these new epistemologies, new ways of knowing, new ways of creating knowledge, of sharing knowledge, and as a result are changing some of the ways in which we regard authorship, some of the ways in which we regard validity, and so on. And a lot of people are talking, Clay Shirky, Andrew Keen, there are a lot of people who are passing opinions on these issues. What I am prepared to acknowledge is that each cohort has unique characteristics, and there's something about this current cohort that universities are facing which is a particular digital challenge. So academic staff need to be supported to change constantly, to evolve, and they always have. They've always had to be able to adapt to a new changing context, whether it was the adaptation to larger class sizes, whether it was the incorporation of fairly primitive, what we would now think of as fairly primitive educational technologies for display and presentation, the use of sound, and so on. And in the paper that I've written, I slightly facetiously, perhaps, I've suggested that, you know, our grandparents who were perhaps, I'm very fortunate that my parents were the first generation, in a sense, to go to university. Well, actually, I should correct that. My parents didn't go to university, but their friends did. You know, it was that generation that was able in the 50s and 60s to access university. And for them, they were doing something quite new. They used workbooks. They followed set texts. They actually had printed textbooks. And their parents and grandparents would have had a very different approach. So I think it's important to recognize that there is this gradual evolution over a period of time. And institutions are very slow to evolve. I worked briefly at Oxford, which taught me that institutions take around 800 years to come to a consensus, by which time it doesn't really matter. And I think what I'm suggesting is that there is a serious issue here of identity for individual academics and for our universities. Universities need to respond to their particular context, whether it's a national context, a regional context, increasingly, of course, a European market and an international market. But we still have institutions, particularly universities, and to some extent schools, that are grounded in 19th century, not 20th century, but 19th century notions of knowledge creation and stewardship, the custodial, the looking after of the knowledge, which are perhaps completely outdated in the current digital environment in which knowledge is created and shared, spliced and diced, the term mashup, which you may be familiar with. So there's a pressure on institutions increasingly sometimes to specialize, and there's also a pressure on universities to personalize. So those two things, you know, work against each other. They're often asked to think, are they really a physical sciences institution? Are they really a liberal arts institution? Can they really do all the subjects? Should they be sharing some subjects between institutions to save money? Can they all afford to have chemistry laboratories or engineering workshops? So there's a pressure for specialization, and at the same time, a pressure for personalizing the learning for learners. And all the time, a desire to ensure that our universities are socially relevant. So institutions, when they come to look at e-learning, tend to do one of three things. They either do what we sometimes refer to in English as an institutional rollout. They simply adopt, sometimes as a result of a small group of people who don't know very much, talking to another group of people who don't know very much about what they might do. Sometimes they talk to a commercial provider who tells them that their particular virtual learning environment, or VLE, will solve all of their institutional problems and can be integrated into absolutely everything. It will run the university for them if they want it to. And institutions are making these decisions often on very ill-informed basis. And when I was in Zagreb in 2005, one of the conversations that we were having then in the context of WebCT and Moodle and were these kinds of challenges that institutions face. So they often say, this is what we're adopting, this is what we're going to do, in the hope that that's a catalyst for change. They also quite often have a technique for an approach to promote the idea of an e-learning champion at a departmental level, at a course level. That might be incentivized in some form, either financially or buying somebody out of teaching, often buying somebody out of marking and assessment to give them more time to develop something. So they have an e-learning champions approach. And the third approach has been to promote the idea of scholarship, to promote the idea that there is a scholarship of e-learning, a scholarship around learning design or contemporary learning, in the form often of professional development programs. So go and get qualified. And again, your colleagues came out to the UK in 2004 and were looking at a number of options of the kinds of things that they might roll out in terms of e-learning training and development. And institutions have done this. The Open University in the UK has a very popular master's in online and distance education, and a lot of people have taken versions of that and adapted it and so on. Of course, in practice, institutions tend to do all three of those things to a greater or lesser extent. And I think that's something that we might come back to a little bit at the end in terms of questions, is to say which combination of these things is working for you. But that's the fairly classic approach. One of those three or a combination of all three. We have a lovely expression, which I think is an American expression. I don't know if you have it in Croatia. This idea of the elephant in the room, the thing that's very obvious that no one actually wants to talk about. I've actually lost a little bit of weight. Sandra will tell you I have lost a little bit of weight. My joke used to be that I was very uncomfortable talking about the elephant in the room when I was standing at the front of the room. Now I feel a little bit more confident with this analogy. Some of the elephants in the room, because there are several, are the increasing availability of open educational resources. Why would we encourage staff to become e-learning champions and encourage them to produce resource when we know that that resource may well be available? In some contexts, we might be saying, well, let's encourage that member of staff to take resources and customize them for our language context or perhaps for our social context. But increasingly, there are resources out there that are really excellent, and we are still reinventing the wheel. And the reason, in part, is that institutions still have that notion, that 19th century notion of knowledge, that essentially they have to be responsible for both the creation and stewardship of that knowledge. And it simply isn't being academic to go and get something from somewhere else and use it in your teaching and your practice. The irony being that that's actually what happens quite a lot in terms of our research. We may well go and actually look at studies that other people have done and adapt them to our research and use them in our research and model our research on things that people have already done. But when it comes to teaching, we often regard that as unacceptable. The second elephant in the room, which is relevant to what we're talking about today, is the notion of redescribing the academic role. Again, often for financial reasons, institutions are often saying, should we actually be asking that person to do research, or should we dedicate them to teaching? Should we actually have more time spent doing something outside in terms of open access, in terms of outreach, we call it in a UK context, or widening participation to bring other people, disadvantaged people, into the university context? All these challenges, driven often by government policy, that challenge the role, the traditional role of the academic. And the polarity, which I think is very relevant to what we're talking about today, is this, they're not binary opposites, but they're often presented as two sides of the same coin of the content expert, or you're a learning facilitator. You're either a teaching person or you're actually the academic that does the research and creates the knowledge. And we've seen this debate certainly in the UK and in New Zealand and in Australia and in America and in Canada, that's polarizing a little bit how people then approach things like the integration of e-learning. So what I'm suggesting is that it's worth looking at how you go about developing staff and the basis on which you actually develop staff. Now, I would have to say that this is a presentation that, for me, is quite wordy. There are a lot of words because I imagine that you will, many of you will want to be able to see the terminology that I'm using, but I won't provide you with this presentation. I will provide you with a written paper that includes these. So where you see a reference, for instance, that reference is properly referenced in the academic paper. So let me just say then that from my perspective, I don't think it's about integrating technology. I think it's about developing staff to understand learning design in a broader context than simply e-learning. So whilst e-learning might be a useful institutional and political catalyst, it's something that allows us to have this discussion. When I did my presentation at Equibelt a few years ago, I actually did a presentation that described all the different things that E was, and one of the things that E was enhancing. And I think it is about enhancing the quality of learning design. And I say that because if one looks at some of the recent work that's been done around learning design as being situated, as being, if you like, very much about the context in which you're teaching, or you look at the work around how you develop a learning community amongst academic staff, and you look at the idea that things need to be problematized, what you end up with is, I think, a sense that technology is really not what this is about. What this is about is designing learning for the current cohort. And rather than be blinded by the politics or the hyperbole around the idea that there is something distinct about this generation as a net generation, what we should be doing is enabling staff to recognize that there is a constant evolution in the skills, abilities, and expectations of all of the people that they're dealing with, that it's holistic, relational, problematic. And one of the key elements here is the idea that learning should be transparent to the learner. So in a sense, that's my position. I'm going to now mention one possible solution or one possible way that this could be developed. I'm aware of the time, so I'm just going to spend 5 minutes talking about this. But what I've done is to basically say, yes, there might be something that's going on at the moment, but what's going on at the moment is not that suddenly there is this new generation who are somehow radically different from what went before. What's changed is the context, and the context is the thing that we have to prepare staff for. We mustn't prepare staff simply to teach this group of students because of this group we perceive to have particular issues or particular needs, not least because those needs are not evenly distributed. There may be such a thing as the net generation, but it may be in a very narrow socioeconomic band. It may apply much more in one context in one country than in another. So I would argue that there is no such thing as the net generation. There are individuals and groups of people who are certainly more technically aware and connected and who desire a certain kind of reward. And what I'd like to pick up on is this idea that what we should be doing is creating learning that is transparent to the learner, because in doing that, we share the responsibility for learning with the individual student. I'm talking specifically here about higher education, but I think some of these are relevant to compulsory education as well. So in the context of higher education, how do we make the learning transparent? I'm not going to talk about this in massive detail, just by virtue of the amount of time that's available, but this is something that I've been working on for the last 2 or 3 years. And it's partly in a staff development context and partly in a blended institutional context. Let me just explain to you a little bit what this is. This is actually a staff development model. It's a tool to have conversations with staff about the 9 elements that actually go into the different types of engagement that we might expect of students. So we're able to actually say staff-student contact time. I've lost my little arrow at the moment, so I can't point. But at the top there, you can see it says tutor contact time. That's the tutor or the lecturer's contact time with the student is perhaps where most academics tend to see their role. So there's some set reading or learning materials. There's their contact time. And the other things are not necessarily seen as part of a traditional academic role. There may be some facilitation, there may be a little bit of peer moderation, increasingly online learning in Moodle and so on. But other things are seen as bureaucratic exercises, feedback or assessment. That's a bureaucratic activity. It's marking, it's grading. And what I'm suggesting is that actually when you start to have this conversation, and there are some references to this and some further explanation on the internet, some videos on YouTube, there's the suggestion that actually all of these elements are what the learner experiences. So at the center, we have here the program learning outcomes and the paper learning outcomes and the kind of graduate profile. These are all the things that as institutions we define as the need for the student. This is what the student's going to leave with. And all of these 9 elements are what the student experiences in their learning. They experience tutor contact time, but it's one element. It's a fairly small element in some cases. They have access to learning materials. They have access to some kind of facilitation with the tutor beyond contact time, whether it's email correspondence or perhaps a face-to-face tutorial, but in a less formal situation. They have peer moderation in the form of online discussion, or indeed discussion in the pub or the bar or the cafe or over lunch with their colleagues. They have a social context. They don't live at university. They are at home. And in some courses, certainly in some professional courses, their parents may be in the same profession as what they're studying. They have a context in which they can discuss things with people, talk to people. They have a very unique personal context. A lot of our students now are working. They're not necessarily all full-time students. They might have a part-time job that they can draw on and reflect on in their learning. There's the formal process of reflection, the formal process of assessment, and there's the feedback loop that they get from everything they do around this particular learning, prior learning, things they already know, and so on. And what I'm suggesting is that all of these things should be given equal weight, that actually there is as much value in establishing what the personal context and social context for the student is as there might be in assuming that they're going to spend 2 hours with us talking about something in a lecture. And what we've done is my screen's gone slightly funny on me again. I hope yours, I can't see yours, but I'm hoping that it's visible to you. What we've done is we've essentially created a toolkit to enable staff to develop learning along these lines. And as you can see, it's very low tech. It's simply Excel. But what it allows us to do in the bottom right-hand corner here is it allows us to describe the various things that we want learners to do around a particular piece of learning and identify where necessary the technology that we want them to use. And it's a staff development tool because what we've done is we've built into the Excel spreadsheet explanations, clues, advice, guidance, links, which is contextual to that particular institution. So the comments in Excel allow you to pop up different material at different times. So what we're looking to do is to try and achieve a situation where the learning process is not about identifying a specific piece of technology that you want to integrate into your teaching practice. I think that's the wrong way round. What we're saying is don't look at integration. Look at your current practice, deconstruct your current academic practice, and reconstruct it for the contemporary environment. When you do that, you have to have a conversation about e-learning. You have to have that conversation because that's the context in which you currently work. But I think if you see it as a technology thing, there is resistance from staff in terms of adopting new technology, thinking, well, other technology is going to come along and replace it, so why waste my time? And there's also a resistance from staff that sometimes says, what I do at the moment works. This is the way I was educated at university. It works. Why would I want to do anything different? And I think we need to have them deconstruct what they do, analyze what they do within some framework, whether it's a framework of situated learning or a framework of holistic learning or a framework around the soul model that I just described, and to reconstruct that. And so we're moving away from the idea that the focus is on a specific generation or specific technology, because those things are constantly moving targets, and focus very much on having staff development skills, training staff, developing staff to take a contemporary situated approach that makes the learning relevant for that particular cohort that they're teaching, with every expectation that they will have to change it next year and the year after and the year after that. So my argument would be, and this is my conclusion, is that integrating e-learning is simply about making all of the learning design that you have appropriate and relevant. Now, I have 3 questions for you, but obviously I'm very happy to take your questions. And I promised Sandra I would do that in half an hour, and I think I just did it in 28 minutes. I think, yes, those are terms that I have used them. I mean, I have used them in writing in the last 10 years myself, but I think they are terms which are somewhat misleading. They're very popular amongst policymakers because they're succinct notions, they're concepts. They allow you to package up together a set of ideas and say, there is this thing. I think the danger with that is that people then respond to that without any further analysis. So I think in truth, we should be talking about the degree to which, in a sense, we might be digital citizens. I mean, if we are citizens of a digital world, what is the nature of that citizenship? And it doesn't matter if you arrive quite late. You could become a citizen. I think some people will choose not to, and some people, and I worry about academic staff who choose not to become digital citizens. But I don't like this idea that one is a digital immigrant. Apart from anything else, the terms are slightly pejorative. You know, the notion of it being an immigrant somehow assigns value to it. So I don't think it's actually accurate. I just think it's a policy convenience that those terms have been used. Thank you. That's actually a really interesting question. It's a very nice way of challenging that distinction between e-learning and distance and open and online and what that all means. Again, I mean, I'm like others. I will use those terms. I have got that experience at the Open University, but also at Massey University, which regarded itself as a blended institution. It had individual courses that were often taught on multiple sites, but also online at the same time. So it would have students doing the same paper with the same content, but doing it in an online environment with a different form of facilitation. And that was a very interesting experience. The answer to your question about whether I see them as the same, I actually think all of those terms are about learning context. And if we focus on the learner, on the specific design for the specific learning context of the learner, as opposed to the institution saying, we're now going to do distance education, then what you need to do is to look at the particular situation that the learner is in and say, how does that learner get sufficient facilitation, sufficient engagement, sufficient high quality materials, sufficiently active learning experience, opportunities for feedback, opportunities to share what they know, to build knowledge, to work on substantial foundational knowledge on their own, where that's relevant, or to get specific guidance at an individual level. So those kinds of questions are about context. And when we assign these labels, we say it's about distance education, or it's about online education, or it's about e-learning. I think what we're doing sometimes is we're taking the focus off the particular context of the learner, and we're more concerned then with institutional norms and institutional ways of doing things. Does that answer your question? The LSE is actually a very interesting institution. It's actually a very conservative institution in many respects. And it has a model of education which is not Oxford and Cambridge, but isn't the norm for a lot of universities in the UK, which are again fairly large classes, and it's not unusual to have 30 students, 40 students in the room. The LSE, London School of Economics, is a little bit different in that there is a cap, a limit on the number of undergraduates and postgraduates that can be in any one class. So if you have a class this afternoon, I'm going into London this afternoon, I'm going to be talking to 200 students from accounting in a lecture theatre, but those students are all guaranteed that each week they have a class where there will be no more than 15 students in the class. So on big courses, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of classes taking place. Okay, so that's the model of education. It's not Oxford tutorial, but it's a limited, focused situation. I'm fairly new, as you know, to the London School of Economics. I've been there 4 months, and I'm there as an educational developer, not as an e-learning person. The e-learning is managed by a group called the Centre for Learning Technology at the LSE. And I think they've taken a very intelligent approach in terms of the adoption of technology, because they've been aware, as I just described in my presentation, they've been aware of the context. So they've used Moodle to support that system of the small class. They've put time and effort into trying to optimize the quality of the lectures. So we have lecture capture, we have an emphasis on interactive voting within the large courses, and so on. So what they've done is they've tailored their response to the particular model. And that's actually what I've said in my presentation, is one has to do an analysis of the context of your particular institution or your particular department, and then look at what the learning design is and adjust the learning design accordingly. So I find, as an educational developer, when I'm talking to an individual member of staff at the LSE, I'm talking to them about their learning design. I'm talking to them about what they do, what they want to do, how they plan to do it. And in the process, I can have a conversation with them about e-learning. But I don't have to go in and say, you should be doing this with e-learning because it's a really good idea. I start with the challenge, whatever the educational challenge is, and the e-learning is actually the response to that challenge. I personally think that we do actually need to do something fairly radical. And you will know, Sandra, I said this a few years ago, in terms of revolutionizing its ability to revolutionize institutions. I think we do have to do something quite radical. But what we need to do is, at an individual level and at an institutional level, because the two things are directly related, to rethink what our individual roles are, and as a consequence, therefore, what our institutional roles are. So yes, I think there is actually something. It's not enough to simply bolt on the idea that you can enhance what you currently do with some new piece of technology and say, I've done e-learning now because I've provided this bit of support for my course. I think if you do that, it becomes extremely messy, and you end up with huge diversity outside of any sense of common shared ownership. So you end up with some academics in the institution resenting what other people are doing in the institution, and that can be quite destructive. There has to be a conversation, both amongst us all as professionals, but also a conversation at an institutional level. Departmental, the deans can have those conversations with the heads of departments. The deans themselves can have those conversations. Rectors can have those conversations. People need to be talking about how they respond to an evolving knowledge landscape and what staff need to be enabled to do to make that effective.